Hi, I'm Simon Garnett.
And I'm Laura Halliday.
And this is The Persuasion Game, the Forges podcast all about the art of persuasion.
Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their consumers, convince their stakeholders and drive their business forward. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Laura. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Today, we are going to be thinking about a very traditional category that has undergone some really interesting disruption. I can think of quite a few categories that of sort of formal, traditional codes that have had some really disruptive players. So Monzo in the banking sector or Lemonade in the insurance sector.
We do indeed. And you're absolutely right. That this whole concept of insurgence, disruption, it's the, anyone in private equity and venture capitalism, that's what they want to hear, right? They want to hear about, come into a category, shake it up, give me something completely different.
Well, if any of you live or travel around southwest London, you will have seen that there is a funeral director who is looking to do something rather different.
On today's episode, we're joined by Poppy Mardall, the founder of Poppy's Funerals, a company that's redefining the funeral industry with a fresh perspective. Poppy is challenging the established norms of the funeral business, focused on creating an experience that empowers people to feel autonomous and supported during one of life's most difficult moments.
We'll explore how Poppy has succeeded in creating a space where death can be discussed more openly, alongside the challenges of disruptive positioning in the face of deeply ingrained cultural behaviours. Welcome, Poppy.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's really going to be very interesting to talk to you. Thank you. Poppy, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this line of work?
Yes. So I think most people think I must have had a terrible experience with death, and I didn't have a terrible experience. For me, it was much more, I was in my late 20s and found myself having a lot of fun working at Sotheby's auction house. So I had studied art, I was in the art world, and I just knew in my bones that this wasn't where I was meant to be. I wanted to do something more purposeful. And I'd say I spent 2 years trying to figure that out from the inside and got to the point of realizing, I'm not going to figure this out while I'm here. So I quit my job with 3 months savings, had some ideas. None of them were as interesting as becoming an undertaker. And then I went to Ghana. I traveled in Ghana for 5 weeks and I got typhoid, and then I was ill for 9 months. And I think that was very helpful in I think lots of people share those moments in life of where you get stopped in your tracks and all the kind of ideas you had go out the window because you can't follow them, because in that situation I was recovering. So what that gave me was not I thought I was going to die, made me think about funeral directors, but much more a sense of just a lot of time to think much more openly about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to have an impact. And what drew me to becoming a funeral director was sort of two things. One was I was really looking for something kind of frontline, something really practical, something where I could have a really tangible impact. I had this real sense of I want to lie in bed at night and kind of know what I did today. And I think the second thing was chance. So there were 3 or 4 exposés on TV within about 6 months of each other showing really bad practice in the sector. And then on the other side, I felt really unacceptable standards of care for the living as well. So sort of treating the grieving person like car salesman type thing, so gold package, silver package, bronze package. Do you want sort of 1 limousine or 2 or 3? Pushing people to buy things they didn't want or need. When I felt goodness, this is the most vulnerable moment in one's life, and it comes to all of us. And how have we created this really kind of conveyor belt, salesy, kind of bad salesy experience, when I think what people need is to feel held. People are coming because they need an experience, and the job of a funeral director should be to kind of help them figure out what it is they need. And so there was a bunch of reasons why that work just sort of called to me, and I thought, it did feel a bit mad, and a few people around me thought it was a bit mad, but I also like things that are a bit countercultural.
Brilliant. Amazing story. Thank you, Poppy. We said at the beginning that you're really looking to change and challenge some of the established norms within the industry. Tell us a little bit about what is different about Poppy's. What are you trying to change?
I think first thing is that this is a experience. So we are selling a service that comes with products. And the products are beautiful and special, and lots of them are handmade. But the most important thing is the way you feel during the experience. And I think the funeral industry has kind of become known for selling stuff, so you walk into a funeral director's and it's often full of stuff. So it'll be in the windows, there might be sort of stonemasonry and urns, and you'll be handed a kind of laminated folder full of coffins and asked, which one do you want? And for most people, it's like, well, I've never wanted to buy a coffin. I don't really know.
It's not an aspirational purchase. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And leaves you feeling more and more and more at sea. Whereas the experience we create at Poppy's, like we talk about a safe landing, so that people often, when they first speak to us, which is often on the phone, or sometimes they walk into our shop in East Sheen or our other space in Tooting, and they will talk about a sense of like, oh my goodness, you are kind, normal people. And I wasn't expecting that. I was sort of expecting to be harassed and harangued to buy stuff. And you've made me a cup of coffee and you've asked me about what it is I need and what it is I'm trying to do. And that has sort of changed my perspective on why I'm here today. I don't have to be in this sort of defensive crouch because I've expected you to try and sort of fleece me. I can kind of open my mind and kind of open my heart and think, okay, what is it that we're trying to do? And recognizing that for one group of people, that will be very different to another. So lots of people are coming to us wanting and needing, the very traditional funeral experience. And if that's what you need, that's what you should get, So there are other people coming who want to minimize impact on the environment. There are other people coming wanting to express all of the kind of wildness and fluorescence of their friend who only wore leopard print, So for us, we don't try and squeeze you into a sausage machine of our making. We are trying to make you feel safe and held and heard, and then we will go about organizing the experience that you need and want.
You mentioned coming into your store, or your space rather, and it's really interesting how strikingly different it looks and feels on the high street compared to other funeral directors. Can you talk to us a little bit about that kind of aesthetic and how that informs the philosophy?
Yeah. So we have this stunning space in East Sheen, which is kind of on a corner. It's a corner space, and so we've got 2 walls of glass, and our branding is a kind of dahlia peach colour. And then when you come in, what you will find is smiley, smart, sometimes brightly dressed people who are warm and welcoming. And then on the inside, there are also kind of lots of photos of things our clients have done. Some of them are very traditional and some of them are kind of less so. And so what we're trying to do in that space is really break down that barrier that we feel exists around the space, but also the conversation, that most people walk into a funeral director's only when they absolutely have to. And they do so often with trepidation, both that the space feels a bit weird and outdated and maybe even spooky, and also that we want people to come in as soon as they feel ready. So there are people that just drop in, they walk past and they see a sign that says, come in and chat to us. And they absolutely do, and sometimes that's with a past experience in mind. Sometimes that's with a future experience in mind, or sometimes it's just to have a conversation, because it is weird that we don't talk about death in a world where, it's one of the only 2 experiences apart from birth that unites us. So we know from our work that the more you talk about this ahead of time, the more control and empowerment you'll feel to have the experience that's right for you when the time comes, even if that's just one conversation. So that's what we're trying to do, is encourage people to have conversations whenever they're ready.
Poppy, there's a really interesting thing you're talking here about expectation. That when we go into these kind of environments, that there's a certain expectation of what we're going to get, or the experience we might have. And it feels like you're really trying to challenge or change some of those expectations.
Yes, definitely, which is hard because people don't like talking about this subject. So what we find, we talk about that the norm with funerals is not normal. Like, it might be the norm, but that doesn't make it normal. It's actually quite weird and strange when you stop to think about it for even 2 minutes. And we're trying to create a new normal where people feel able to ask for what they need and then get it. And in order to do that, we need to sow a seed that better is possible. And clearly the easiest way to do that, or the most effective way to do that, is by seeing it be done. So we have a sort of interesting curve, I guess, with people who, not just the clients who employ us, but obviously everyone who then engages with our service, which, might be a group of people, it might be hundreds of people, that their expectations at the beginning are often pretty limited. And what we see and hear again and again is a sense of very, very positive surprise of, I just didn't know this was possible. I didn't know it was possible to feel like this. Obviously, as funeral directors, we can't change the outcome, but we can be by your side through the experience. And the best way to do that is just to show people how it can be done.
You mentioned that, the norm is not normal. And I think we all have those visuals in our heads of sort of Oliver Twist style, plumes and black horses. Can you talk to us a little bit about the sort of history of funeral directors and what that kind of, those normal codes, as it were, are?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because there are sort of two threads. There's the very traditional sort of Dickensian thread, and then there's the sort of more recent capitalist thread. So I'll talk about both. But the origins of funeral directing were carpenters. So the undertaker was the person who undertook the thing that, or the things that the family or community weren't able to do. And 150 years ago, that was making the coffin, so that people would die at home and they'd be cared for at home, and they'd be buried quite soon. And so the thing you didn't have was a coffin, and so the carpenter would bring a coffin to the house where family and community would put the person in the coffin, and then you'd be carried to the burial place and buried. And then since then, like many other trades and businesses, the undertaker became a funeral director and kind of stretched into a much wider professional space, which works, I think, for people now. I think most people don't expect to have a funeral in 2 days. It's not, lots of people want to die at home, but it's not that common. Most people do want someone to help with much more. But I think we have to be wary of any service that has sort of crept up and made us feel like we couldn't do it without them. I think there's a lot of power, not good power, when we sort of hand over things that my sense is funeral directors can and should take on the things the family want them to take on, but we are doing it on your behalf. It is, we are not we don't have any potions out back that change anything. We are simply caring for the person who's died and caring for you and delivering something that you need. And I think because we're so scared of death, we've sort of handed over too much power to funeral directors, and it's sort of like, ooh, like whatever they say we'll do.
But then there's also challenges that come from being a challenger. Can you speak a little bit about those?
Yeah. I think the challenge that people expect that I don't think is there is that by doing things in a more thoughtful, empathetic way somehow causes issues within the sector, and that's not been the case. So I'm really proud of the fact that 12 years in, most other funeral directors would say good things about us. They'd say they do a good job and their clients seem happy, and some of them are imitating things in a way that's great. I think the challenges really come around, as I said earlier, getting people to think about this before they need to. So quite a common experience for me is for someone to meet me and to say, oh, we really could have used you 6 months ago. Or sometimes even I've met someone and then I see them a year later and they say, oh, we needed you 6 months ago and I completely forgot you existed, and I just walked to the local high street branch of whatever. So I think that's an issue that trying to get people to think about death is difficult. And I think that's partly because of how the conversation has historically been presented, that I wouldn't necessarily want to walk into a old-fashioned funeral directors and talk to them about someone I love dying, but I would walk into somewhere like Poppy's. So it doesn't feel insurmountable at all, but I think it's about reality and patience and kind of doing everything possible to meet people where they are at. You can't force someone to have this conversation.
Can you talk a little bit about empowerment? It sort of feels like agency has been removed, whereas listening to the way you're talking and what you're trying to do with Poppy's sounds very much like actually it's trying to bring a little bit of empowerment back to the individual and the people grieving.
Yeah, definitely. And making the point too that empowerment doesn't mean that you have to have a big emotional transformational experience. Most of our clients are people who are buying something that on the outside looks very similar to what they would have bought from another funeral director's. Superficially, it's the same funeral. The difference is in the experience. So no one comes to Poppy's and accidentally gets sold anything. People get what they want, it precisely. And that, from a grief point of view, is really important, because this is one of the key moments that you will look back on for the rest of your life. And I don't say getting it right as in by some kind of superficial judgmental standards, but getting it right for yourself. There are things normally that people feel they need to do. Yeah.
What do you think have been some of the sort of moments in their experience with Poppy's that have been the light bulb moments that have persuaded them that there was a different approach, that a different outcome was feasible? What do your clients say to you were kind of key moments in that journey?
Yeah, they say to us all the things you'd expect them to say of any good sort of bank, or, they talk about us being deeply responsive and deeply efficient and fairly priced. And I don't want to, I think those things should always be at the top of the pyramid, because you might be trying to do magical other things, but if you can't hit those notes, then you've failed. So, answering an email quickly, picking up the phone quickly and solving the problem fast. Most people arriving with us are pretty flustered. Most people haven't really thought about this before. And I think the thing we do first of all is this kind of giving people space, actually, to kind of take a breath. And some people are coming at a real gallop of, all the cousins want to know when the funeral's going to be, and there's all these expectations. And so we have, one client, or we always have one client, but sometimes, a small group of people, and we get the chance to say, okay, that's good. We can do this in a few days if that's what you need, but shall we just take a moment? And I think in that moment, what happens is it turns from a sort of process into an experience. So yes, we will tick all the boxes and you will get your invoice on time, but let's just also make sure you are taking a moment to think about what you need. And even just that question is big for people, because I think a huge number of people, they were organizing the funeral like you might get a visa to travel to a certain country. It was like another thing they had to do. And it's sort of in this moment, we get to nudge them to think, this is a sort of once in a lifetime experience for this person. And in the process of, making sure it comes in on budget and that Uncle Edward is happy, what do you specifically need? And then quite quickly things start coming out. It doesn't mean you need to take lots of time. It doesn't mean you need to do lots of soul searching, but it's just 2 or 3 crucial questions. We have this real gift for kind of having difficult conversations in a really straightforward but kind way.
Thank you, Poppy.
It feels like this idea of, selling an experience rather than selling stuff is so key to your offer. And we hear about that a lot in other categories as well, that people are we've reached peak stuff and we're looking for experiences. But I suppose one thing it's quite difficult to do is convey what that experience is going to be like, because it's not a world that people really think about or necessarily, hopefully, have lots and lots of experience of. So just bringing it back to how you sort of sell that, how you promote that. What are some of the vehicles you use to actually convey what the experience is like?
Yeah. So that's true, and at the same time, if you are outstanding in your field, then you send people away almost unable to not spread the word. And that's what we see, is that the vast majority of our clients have heard about us from someone else who's been to a funeral or been cared for. And you'd think, wouldn't you, it's a hard thing to say to someone, might you need a funeral director? Possibly one of the hardest. Much easier to say, have you been to that great new pizza place? But what I see, and what I'm thrilled to see, is nurses, ministers, community members are so kind of horrified that their neighbours wouldn't get the Poppy's experience. They can't help themselves. We produce a lot of really excellent objective information and kind of guidance. So we have a really great blog and we're pretty strong on social media. So the other thing is, I think there's something about having really great information out there also that sets the tone, like, oh, these guys are different. And then I think the last piece is that when you offer outstanding experiences, that those decisions are made from a much more emotional place. It's not people definitely ask us when they call us about cost, and they ask us about geography and the kind of practical stuff. But I think they are captured by the possibility of the experience, and then the decision is emotional. And I think if we can reach out to people in that way, then we can do well.
It's so interesting what you mentioned about your colourways as well, because I live locally in Tooting, and I saw the poster that you have outside the cemetery, and it is literally like a little pop of sunshine in an area that's otherwise quite dark. I suppose, is that something that you intentionally thought about with your out-of-home marketing, like where you positioned yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I think that pop of sunshine is how a lot of our clients would describe us, that they've maybe come from the register office, or they've been through the coroner, or they had to get involved with the police, or they've just picked up the forms from the bereavement office in the hospital, and they get to us. And it's not we're not kind of smiling idiots, like we love supporting people who've been through often something really tough. But that doesn't mean, like, being dour doesn't help. Do you know what I mean? Being warm and welcoming is everything. So yeah, definitely. We've placed some of our adverts near other funeral directors too. We kind of love the idea of people kind of popping into going to pop into a competitor, in the knowledge that that's often done without much previous proactive thought, and that might create a kind of moment of diversion as well in their day. Fantastic.
Can I come on to talk? So you've talked very eloquently about, for those people who are in that sort of moment of need, and just showing them that there is a different way. Talk to me a little bit about how you've and successes you've had about trying to kind of get people who maybe aren't so close to that point of need, but just to engage with this conversation. Because as you rightly say, we are guaranteed to be born and we're guaranteed to die. Everything else in the middle, hopefully, but not guaranteed. What successes have you had of trying to persuade people to engage in a conversation that, frankly, is not necessarily one we're prone to want to discuss?
Yeah. We've tried loads of things and we've done loads of things, but the two things I think that have really stood the test of time have been, one, we do this thing called My Funeral Wishes, and it's a free 40-minute consultation that can be at a Poppy's location or at home, or it's most often done online. And it is a conversation where you get to explore your hopes, wishes, anxieties, fears about your funeral, but also anything else around that time. So it is not a funeral plan. So the way that most funeral directors are trying to drag customers over the line is by selling them funeral plans. And there is a place for a funeral plan. A funeral plan is basically a financial product where you sort of decide now what you'd want, and then you pay for it now. And the idea is that the money goes into a trust, and so you're sort of protected from inflation. The issue is, I'm not sure that the vast majority of people I speak to need a financial product. What they want and need is a warm, open conversation to transfer the kind of cycling thoughts in their head about what will happen when into something that can feel quite positive and practical. So I think for us, it's about creating this opportunity to allay fears and, as I say, sort of transform anxieties into something quite day to day. So that's My Funeral Wishes. And then the second thing we do is we run death cafes. And Death Cafe is a movement that was started in 2012 by an amazing man called John Underwood, with no agenda and no structure. So it's a kind of 90-minute conversation, often happens in a cafe. The rules are you eat cake and drink tea and talk about death. And John's thinking was that if you can create opportunities for people to think and reflect on death, you can help them make the most of their finite lives. And so we run quarterly death cafes in Tooting and East Sheen, which is it's a very different type of person comes along. So it's often people from 30s to 80s, and they're coming because they do want to talk about death, and they find that nobody else around them thinks that's normal. And so you have these wonderful conversations. It's not a bereavement cafe, so it's not obviously grief is welcome, but it's not a kind of active bereavement cafe. It's a place to come and be really curious and to open up the conversation. So those two things have been great. And as I say, it's about meeting people where they're at. We can't force people to have these conversations. And also we are available for people at 3 a.m. in the night if someone has just died and that's the first time they've spoken about it.
Just one observation of that I think is really interesting is the way that you've embraced that word death rather than trying to sort of avoid it or come up with a euphemism, that instead it's redefining how we see that and our comfort levels with it.
Yeah. And my sense is that a lot of what's gone wrong in the sector has been born of a kind of well-meaning paternalistic desire to sort of protect people from something that's actually already just happened, And it's like, if we can't talk about it, imagine you're grieving, and grief can be so lonely. And as a society, we're not very good at supporting each other because we're so scared. It's like, if your funeral director can't even say the word, then you really are on your own. So we have to be explicit. We will always reflect back the language a client uses. So if someone calls and says, my father's passed, then we'll use that language too. But we would never lead with that because we need to be able to show them that we can handle it.
We see this idea of like not having conversations about things you can't change being challenged in all sorts of categories, from things like menopause, for example, or long-term illness. It feels like culturally we're much more confident in having those conversations. What's your aspiration about where your category can actually go with conversations around death?
I think if every group of friends or every family or every community was able to bring up death and grief without anyone in the room looking like someone's dirty washing had just been hung out. I think you're right. It's very much like things like the menopause. It's happening. It's always happened. None of this is new. And to know that you're not alone, to know this is actually one of the unifying realities of being human, that's what I'd like. I'd like people to be able to say, my dad just died, or I want to think ahead because I want to kind of protect my children or support my children to know that they can do what they need when I die. And for everyone in the room to say, what a brilliant thing. Good on you. How responsible. And then for those people to be met by funeral directors and perhaps other people in the sector who could emerge, who could help facilitate those conversations, would be my dream.
Fabulous. Poppy, you started by telling us about the sense of purpose and mission that led you to found Poppies. When you project forward to the future, what keeps you going?
I sort of can't bear the idea that people are having experiences that are so unnecessary. And it's so easy, it's so simple to get it right. But my sector has got a bit distracted and lost along the way. And so I think that's what drives me, is that sense of, this care that I feel personally so able to give to the people I love. I want to be available to everyone. How powerful it can be to do those 2 or 3 things you need to do in this moment you'll never get to live again. And I'm endlessly meeting people who didn't get to do those things, who 50 years later are still stuck in that moment. And yeah, it definitely will happen because everybody needs this. And, Poppies won't be the one to provide it to everyone, but I think there's no going back now.
Thank you so much, Poppy. This was a really enriching conversation.
Fabulous. Thank you, Poppy.
Thanks for having me.
So, Laura, a lot to think about on that one. What resonated with you?
I really enjoyed the conversation. It did make me think about the role of experts and how we've seen in a lot of analogous categories this idea of sort of being talked down to and like subject to a one-size-fits-all. I think the other thing that was really telling to me was the respectful and human-centric way that she was disrupting. So it wasn't about being an evangelical and going, there's another way of doing it. Everyone wears colours, let's all be super happy about death. It was very much about the individuals, taking time to understand your individual audience, mirroring their needs, their language, and kind of taking them on as comfortable a journey as they were comfortable going. That she can still do all of the traditional cues and codes if that's what's needed. So I think, individuality and meeting people on their level were the 2 big takeouts for me.
Great. For me, I think one of the things that really stood out because frankly, I see this on so many categories in marketing that we work in, is this sense of being on an unconscious, almost like a conveyor belt through this experience, through this kind of purchasing journey, that you come into it going, well, I know how this category operates. I know the rules. And therefore, you're just sort of a bit closed off to it, But what she talked about was a pause. We just have a moment. And it was this idea of jolting someone on that journey and just getting them to realize, actually, am I engaging with this consciously? Have I really thought about what I want to do? Is there another way? Is there an alternative? And I think that's so important across, as I say, all sorts of categories, whether they're really complex and infrequent purchases, or whether, frankly, they're kind of everyday and we're just so used to it that we kind of get bored with them. This idea of finding a moment just to try and pause someone in their journey and get them to reflect and reframe.
To challenge the unnormal norm.
Exactly. Great. Well, I look forward to seeing you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app.
And just the last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on socials. Search for The Forge on LinkedIn.